Hey guys, Justin here, of course, with AdSquad. I'm going to answer the how do you do creative testing for the best impact for your advertising, for your frameworks, to compare and see what works. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of that now. Now, before I switch over to the ads manager and I say, okay, ABO, CBO, all of those, base details, what I'm going to start with is your persona and your framework. Before you enter the ads manager, and something we see time and time again with different media buyers, different brands, different even our own team, is the work done outside of the platform is just as, if not more valuable than what's done in the platform. Because when you get in platform, there's a tendency we see, which is like laziness, and laziness bleeds into the ads manager if it is not done properly. And so that starts outside of it. We all know, the algorithm history and how initially you had to be like, hack the system, find this interest group and that interest group. And you could throw up anything in terms of creative. You could be like, here's our product, terrible static, and it would work. But understanding that was like 2019, 2020, and then we got into the pixel degradation, and then it shifted to the algorithm being more efficient. Now, where and how is the algorithm more efficient? It is specifically more efficient with your creative. Now is the whole concept of what is broad, narrow. Broad being your targeting, letting the algorithm bring in who it thinks, and narrow being your targeting based on the persona. And then within the persona, there is a framework that responds, or that the persona should respond to that creative framework. I'm going to give you a quick example. Why is this important? Because if you don't do this or understand this on the outside, you're going to lump all these things together and go, I don't know, I threw it in an Advantage Plus and it just didn't work. Again, we got to do a little bit of forward, thinking or planning, so then you can leverage what, Meta is doing. And again, this is done at different scales. Like if you're spending, 1K a day versus 10K a day, very different range of impact. But so with that, you have an understanding of your frameworks. And if you're not, you're working, your CD or, creative director is going to give you these frameworks. So let's say we have this right here. Persona 1, 2, and 3. Of each of those personas, primary, audience, primary user, you have one framework for each one. We'll just make it easy. Persona 1, framework 1, persona 2, framework 2, persona 3, framework 3. Or instead of having three different personas, you're only going after one, but you have three different frameworks. You have to make that distinction on the outside. Then within those creatives you're receiving, you have to make sure to only group together the frameworks that are similar or comparable. So typically framework 1, you have 5 different shots. So it's going to be an example. We've got a UGC creative framework where it's an unboxing, where in the first 3 seconds, someone is going to do this. Different people doing it, different scripting a little bit, but the general framework is the same. Now, when I know that, as the media buyer, they're all labeled appropriately so I can quickly determine what is and what isn't working. Now, in the ads manager, there's a lot of hoopla back and forth. But if you have an existing ads manager where, let's say, you're spending a minimum of 25 to 50K a month, you have what should be a seasoned, broad ad account. And if you don't, let's say you're really dependent on like one interest group, that's not bad. But when you come into creative testing, you should be going broad, being completely wide open broad, letting Meta, because the algorithm knows who your customer is, or it should know who your customer is. If it doesn't, that's a whole other ball of wax. Then what you're going to do in the simplest way is you're going to group them into a ABO, depending on how much framework creative you have. If you only have like 5 creative, you can run a CBO and that's fine. An ABO framework where you're essentially going to build that campaign, broad-based testing, and you're going to limit no more than 5 creatives per ad set. You're going to say, why 5? Why can't I just put 50 in Advantage Plus? So Advantage Plus is a little bit different, especially because Advantage Plus targeting is going to go anywhere in the funnel, right? We just want to go top, purely cold, broad, no exposure. And then within this ABO with 5 creatives per ad set, you're going to exclude all engagement, all purchaser. You want completely pure cold audience targeting. Now that I've got the ABO set up and I'm doing 5 ads per ad set within that broad-based targeting, I'm going to set each of them up. Typically, I would do 3 to 5 depending on your section. Now, if you have a different persona, we typically group campaign-based persona. It depends on how much creative you're pushing. If you're pushing like 30 pieces of creative, you typically have more than one persona, one campaign ABO, strictly for persona-based sake, then with 5 individual. The big question comes in now with budget. what is your budget amount? And so what we do on the outside, and this is helpful for you to do as well, is you really want to set up a percentage base of your testing with your budget, because the last thing you want to do is have more than 30% of testing-based spend, because when you get over that 35%, now essentially you're going to reduce the effectiveness of your ad account to test new creative, and given only 3 out of 10 is typical hit rate of creative, that means you've got like a 70% loss, or not necessarily loss, ineffective creative that's there. And so the more you creep up to that 40%, 35%, the more you're going to bring the whole account down. And when you bring the whole account down, again, you're telling the algorithm, think of it like a toddler, this is good, you're bringing me good things, and it's not good, right? Because you're testing all this creative. So you keep it on a 30% spend. For us, we typically designate per persona an amount of spend so we have an even playing field. And what we're not doing is we're coming over here and we're disproportionately creating, and I'll just give you just like a zoom out. This again is the creative testing framework. This is, AdSquad framework, insert the framework, and this may be persona 1. If you have multiple personas, I like to make sure they're separated at the campaign level, which just keeps it really clean. And if not, what you'll find is a disproportionate amount of spend on one persona just because it has 1 or 2 creatives that are working in a framework, and it's not carried over to the other. And then when you go back up here to your mapping, you're going to see, well, persona 1, which is only like 15% of my consumer base, is getting 15% of my budget and spend just because I got a lot of creative for that and I just lumped it in there and it's just simple. Again, step back. You want to make sure you understand the persona, the budget, the amount of spend, and how you're doing testing. Now, that's not the end. That's the setup. As you're watching this spend, as you're optimizing, as you're turning things off, what you're really wanting to do is you're really wanting to identify which creative is performing best at what level. Because if you go back and if you begin to dissect and looked at your prior ads, what was converting, what wasn't converting, what you're bringing in and testing, you're testing not only trends, creative, new variety, you're also wanting to kind of find that concentric circle a little bit of what resonates best with our product or service or offering, and what resonates best with the creative that is presenting that. And the more you overlap and the more you look, one, the better Meta is going to get, because in theory, this is all data generation cycles, right? You're giving more data that Meta likes, that your customers like, and you're getting a positive response, and then you keep feeding that. The same with spend, the same with creative, and the same with targeting. But before you get into it, always encourage everybody, this is what we do, this is what we encourage every brand to do, break up who your persona is distinctively, right? It can't be a 42-year-old here and a 44-year-old there. It's got to be distinctive, like 25 to 34, like that. And then the framework that resonates to them. If you don't have really big, distinct personas, then you can essentially say, okay, women 30 to 55, right? Okay, that's your broad-based persona, and then your creative is going to have to speak to that. Now, it's always better to have a really narrow, specific piece of creative, because then the algorithm is going to say, okay, the primary consumer is a 42-year-old female who lives in this area, looks like this. The creative matches and emulates that, so it speaks really well, so they resonate, they click, they open, they buy. And beyond that, you just want to keep feeding that. So without a really long overview, go back over here, creative framework testing, label it, persona-based, percentage of persona-based, ABO, 5 creatives, no more than 30% of testing or budget on testing and spend. If you have segmented ad accounts, that's okay. Typically, we do that if it's like health or supplements or things like that. That way you don't get in trouble and you don't bring your whole ad account performance down. But typically around 30% of the budget is in creative testing. So typically there's a lot of questions. There's like, how do I scale? How do I, take this and run with it? When do I bring in Advantage Plus? You can test that with 20 plus creatives. Just make sure it's not going full funnel. But typically this is the most effective way we see consistently working. Again, it's called broad-narrow. Broad-based targeting, narrow-based creative. Always a lot of questions, but just for the sake of this video, that is how we set up creative testing for brands spending a minimum of $10,000. Ideally, this works much better when you're at $25,000 to $50,000, because then that 30% of budget is actually significant. If you aren't spending that much, a whole other ball of wax. But all right, with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to send it over. I hope this has been helpful.